We're joined today by David Cohen from Comcast, who seems to know more people here than anyone else I've met. It's unbelievable. And of course, Tara Westover, who has written this extraordinary book, Educated. I literally can't spill wine without hitting somebody who has read this book and had it really transform their life. So let's give them both a big hand before we get started. All right, so, hello.
Can I start off? What is the answer to that question about AI?
Oh, will it de-skill us?
Yeah.
So I think, so the theme that we're pursuing, wow, I can't believe you're interviewing me. This is awesome.
Right.
But the divorce question, that was this.
It's a big one, right? It's a big one. So the people that we've spoken to say it's incredibly useful. They cannot get along without it. And when you are texting your ex-spouse and about to say, you lying bastard, I'll see you in court, literally the AI pops in and says, no, don't say that. You'll wind up in front of a judge. That's going to cost you thousands of dollars in legal fees.
Oh.
And you say, oh, okay, never mind, and you keep to the straight and narrow. So it's a referee that it turns out we may have always needed, but in 10 years, are we going to be able to talk to people that, difficult people in our lives? I don't know. That's
Maybe we use AI not to get divorced.
Or maybe that's right.
Just have it all the time.
Even better.
Computer, who do I love?
When you're fighting, do you really want to say that?
Right, exactly. So I think the threads here are many, and I'll really go anywhere you guys want to. But for me, one of the things that really struck me reading the book, Tara, and I wonder if this might sort of kick us off, is I wonder if you would tell the story, because this is the first instance that I saw in the book where you really described going and looking something up online and it being a really revelatory thing. You were in class, raised your hand, because you didn't recognize a word on the board that your professor had put up. Would you be willing to tell that story?
Yeah, so I didn't go to school because I was raised by survivalists in Idaho, and they didn't believe in school, so I never went. And then a bunch of stuff happened, and I ended up going to school when I was 7, ... And then when I was 17, I was at a university, and that was the first time I'd been in a classroom in my life. And the teacher was talking about this thing I'd never heard of, and I'd seen other students raise their hand and ask questions, so I did that, and I raised my hand, and I said, what is this word? Holocaust, what does it mean? I don't know it. And yeah, I don't recommend doing that. A lot of the...
Yeah.
The other,
but how could you know, right?
I didn't know. I didn't know what it was.
Right.
And I think the other students heard that as anti-Semitism, frankly. They heard it as me denying it, like, what is this?
Yeah.
I meant it completely sincerely,
it?
What is this?
Right.
And so there was just a different world that I'd grown up in. I'd grown up in a world where there wasn't a Holocaust, and then one day there was.
Mm-hmm. And for you, going then to investigate it, you write very beautifully about what it is to then sit down that night and look it up and realize, oh, wow. I mean, I just wonder for you, over and over again in the book, there's this sense that, for your brother, an encyclopedia, for you, any textbook you could really lay your hands on were these portals to another, realm of learning. Did being online serve that purpose for you in any way? Was that at all part of that process, or had you already gone deep into your new life by the time that became part of your...
There wasn't internet when I was growing up. When we didn't have a phone a lot of the time I was growing up, and then we got a TV when I was, I think, 13 or something. We did get internet right before I went to college. And I remember when I was thinking about going to university, I remember I visited the university website, and I do think that those images, seeing these images of these happy students like on this beautiful manicured campus, it looked like a happy place. I think that those images had a pretty big effect on me, just being able to see them. I think that there's a lot being done with technology to try to educate kids. Maybe we're going to create these experiential programs of exciting moments in history, the Civil War or something, or the moon landing, or these interesting things. But I think for some kids, it's as hard to imagine a college campus as it would be to imagine going to the moon.
Right.
Actually,
is that what it was for
the
you?
moon is like a little more familiar
right.
in a way to me. I'd seen pictures of the moon in the encyclopedia set that we had at home, but I think those images were completely foreign to me, actually, in a way that, I think maybe that's the power of technology is to help people with historical events or faraway things, but I I think sometimes it's easy to forget if you come from an urban or an upper middle class environment. Some of the things that are very obvious to you are going to be very foreign to someone who is either poor or rural, just physically isolated from these things, and being geographically isolated from universities is a huge predictor. When they do studies of kids in the US, if you're a very high achieving student but a very poor student, so that two things, really smart but really poor, what are the factors that determine whether or not you're going to make it into a decent university? And geography plays an enormous role. It's actually one of the greatest predictors of whether or not you'll make it into a university. And that's, I think, because isolation, it cramps what people are able to imagine is possible.
Right.
And that seems like something that technology could actually help with. Technology does a lot of really unhelpful things, but that seems like it could be one thing it could do well.
David, you sort of give us an overall sense of sort of where are we at in penetration of these technologies at this point?
Right, so I'll answer that, but let me also just say, to build on what Tara just said, I mean, I think the internet arguably could be the most important technological innovation in the history of the world. But there's a cruel irony around the internet. As much as you can use the internet for, and as Tara says, there are bad things, as many good things as you can use the internet for, it should be a huge equalizer, a leveling of the playing field. And yet, because of what's called the digital divide, the chunk of our country that does not have access to the internet, for geography, for income, for upbringing, for a whole host of reasons, versus the part of our population that does have access to the internet, the cruel irony of the internet, this great equalizer, is that it's actually exacerbating differences and exacerbating inequality in the country.
A lot.
So that's the,
Not a little,
I think that's
a
the
lot.
frame.
Right.
So the numbers are pretty clear. We got about 7%, about 93% of America is wired for broadband. So about 7% of the country that doesn't have the internet because the internet hasn't been built out to their homes, it's not available. But to me, the shocking statistic is, and there are all sorts of studies around on this, and they all have different numbers to them, but somewhere between 3 and 4 times as many people don't have access to the internet, even though the internet has been built out to their homes. So overall in the country, you're talking about between 25 and 30% of Americans are not hooked up to the internet at home. And let me just contrast. Unfortunately, I could reel off statistics. Those aren't the greatest stories, but I'll give you one more statistic. I'll give you 2 more statistics. 70% of the homework assignments that are given out in America today require use of the internet to complete them. And 80% of the Fortune 500 companies only accept job applications online.
Right.
So I don't know whether that's 2 strikes or 5 strikes against someone who doesn't have the internet. They can't do their homework. They can't search for jobs. They can't apply for jobs without the internet. They don't have a sense in their mind of what a university campus looks like. Is this something that I might want to do or that I might be interested in doing? And I think it is one of the most significant public policy, societal problems we have to be able to get everyone in this country connected to the internet, regardless of where they live, regardless of the income level of their families, regardless of the background and the upbringing and whether their parents understand the internet and think it's important for them to have the internet.
Yeah, and so
when I read Educated, because I spend a lot of my time in this space, and the number one barrier to broadband adoption when it's been built out in the community is a lack of digital literacy, lack of understanding of the relevance of the internet, the importance of the internet, fear of the internet, and that's mostly parental.
Right.
I mean, the kids understand how important the internet is, and I thought of your father, and I thought of, even though it wasn't addressed in the book, and you just imagine, if you showed up and said, Daddy, I want to have the internet so I can see what's going on in the world, he would have had a completely different worldview about the importance of being connected to the internet.
You know what's funny about my father and the internet is my mother wanted to get it for her business. She sold herbal and she wanted it, and my dad was very fearful of it. because he was worried it was going to be spying on him, and he had this rule for a while where we could have the internet, but it had to be on a different computer that wasn't connected to anything else, and it had to be in the basement in a dark room, and I thought he was crazy. And he wasn't. Not on that issue. I mean, he was crazy on other things, but that was, so I think part of the conversation about spreading the internet to everyone, another really important part of that, I think, is we've had these technologies for a while now, and we've had enough time to observe them and see what they do to people. And I think part of connecting people to the internet, the other side of that, is taking a really good look about what we are connecting them to. And I tend to think it's time to have a social conversation, a legislative conversation about do we want technologies that we're going to send into the hands of kids that we know are designed to be super addicting? Do we want companies to be able to engage in behavior modification in order to addict them, withholding some of their posts from their friends so that they feel isolated? And then I think these kinds of things, the internet doesn't have to be what it is. That's the wonderful thing. There are wonderful qualities about the internet, and then there are, now we know, really horrible, divisive qualities to the internet. And we can decide. We can make choices about it. So I think there's that part that you're talking about, which is connect everyone, because look what the internet can do. And then there is the other side of it, which is we've had this for a while now. We've been able to observe it. And we are able, as a society, to make choices about what do we want to allow companies to do. Do we want to allow spy capitalism? Do we want to allow that kind of exploitation of teenagers? And I would say probably no.
It's interesting, because you're
I'm going to come out on the no side of that.
And your example, your personal story is the best possible outcome, I mean, after an incredible period of hardship, the best possible outcome in terms of exposure to the internet. You suddenly are, you're looking at college campuses and hatching ambitions for you. It's all the stuff that we would imagine, in the script, we would think
But
this
I'm
is how it's
so
going to go.
grateful that I didn't have Instagram, and I'm so grateful that I didn't have that scrolling mechanism that we know is just incredibly addictive. I mean, we look at now the average time that a teenager spends on the internet is, I think, approaching 7 hours on social media.
You think that maybe
terrifying
your story might have turned out differently if you had had today's
I would
experience?
be afraid of it because I know it's designed to exploit me, and I know I'm exploitable.
I also think about, there are these, that's right.
I think you're tougher than you think, but that's right.
Yeah. It's that thing where, like Burma, right, gets the internet overnight in the way that you did in a way, and yet that's at a time when suddenly there is all of this trouble, and suddenly all kinds of conspiracy theories are flying everywhere, and it's a whole other
Well, they
thing.
get more clicks, frankly.
Right.
I think stories that divide us spread like wildfire, and they're better at selling us stuff, frankly. They're better for advertisers to spread stories of outrage and divisive stories than it is to spread stories of unity. They do better.
Yeah.
So there's a capitalistic motivation, actually, to divide us in order to sell us stuff.
Right.
And these are, the internet, again, it doesn't have to be like this.
Yeah.
It can be different. We just have to make decisions about whether we are willing to live in a world where these massive companies are allowed to engage in this kind of behavior. And we can choose not to do that.
Yeah.
We can just decide, you know what, you're not allowed to do that.
So first of all, you're obviously right about the risks of the internet. So let's start with that. But I just have to go back.
You're like, I didn't bring you on to talk about this.
No, that's all right. No, I think it's great. I think it's absolutely great. I totally agree. This is the conversation we need. But I want to go back to your comment about we got the internet. Why? Because your mother wanted it for her business.
She did, yeah.
That's the ultimate relevance test. In other words, there was a reason for the internet, and that overcame all objections. And so that's when I talk about digital literacy and the relevance of having the internet. Your story is the ultimate story of there was a purpose for having the internet, and that led to the internet coming in. So I agree we should have a conversation. I just want to throw out the concept of, is this really a place where we can expect the government to protect us? Because I don't know, I think we run the risk.
Alternative?
Well, the alternative is, for example, parents to protect their children.
But we have here someone who knows exactly where that can go.
Well, every parent, actually, maybe that was overprotective.
The parents are as hacked as the kids in some cases.
I'm not sure. You can have education, and you can have more education about this. The conversation could lead to more education. I honestly don't know what we would ask the government to do. that would
Right.
solve this problem.
I think you
That's
can
what I
make
struggle
people's
with.
data. You can say people own their data, and you can't sell it. You can't use it to manipulate
Okay,
them, and you
that's-
can't.
Well, not selling data, I agree with you. You can do that. I don't know how you can legislate that, and by the way, this is sort of easy for me because Comcast, we're a big ISP, but we're not engaging, we're providing a pipe
Right.
for other people to do this, but we're not engaging in this conduct ourselves. We're gonna hear from other people
That's right.
at this conference who are gonna talk about this. I think owning your data, yes, that's something the government can do. I think once the government gets into regulating what companies are doing on the internet, it raises a whole host of other issues.
We regulate other things that companies do. Why would we not regulate the internet?
Well, and in your case, I think, Tara, about your specific circumstances that if someone had shown up and said, if a regulatory body had shown up and looked at your situation and said, this is a kid being worked too hard, this is a dangerous situation. I mean, your personal story is one that.
We have a little bit less of that in Idaho.
Yeah, right, that's right.
Fewer regulations overall.
Do you think that you could have, I mean, I don't even know how to formulate this question, but obviously there are all kinds of downsides to what we've seen the internet become since you were looking at college campuses on it. Do you think if you were a kid now on that internet, it would have somehow been better not to have it and to continue the way you had been?
I don't know. I feel like the internet did great things for me, truly. I think even when I would go home over the summer and I would suddenly be back in my parents' house and I'd be isolated again, I would be able to send emails to people I'd met at the university. I still was able to stay connected with them. It's like Harry Potter's owl. It made a difference to me, and it was a positive difference. And I think that's worth defending. I think it's worth pursuing. I think we should connect rural people to the internet because it will open up what they think the world is. I think that's incredibly important. But I don't share the view that we can't regulate it. And I think if you did say that people own their data and you can't use it to manipulate them and you can't sell it to other companies and to let them manipulate them, you can't do this stuff, I think it would make a tremendous difference. There would be a lot less motivation, I think. Right now, the way it's designed, where these companies make money on the number of hours that you spend on their service, so they have every reason to make it as addicting as possible. That doesn't have to be that way. That doesn't have to be the way that it is. And if people owned their data and you couldn't manipulate them as much on it, there would be a lot less reason to engage in some of this really mind-bending behavior. And the behavior that we know, even the company's own research shows, it's incredibly damaging for youth, teen suicides and depression, like skyrocketing. And the research is pretty robust at this point. We know what's causing it, and we could fix it if we wanted.
It's so interesting because I think, I expected from you more of a message, and this is because I've only met you today,
I
more
like
of a message
to shake
of,
things up. I think he did too.
well, this thing of that's right.
I like this, don't worry
It's
about it.
great, it's fascinating, because I think that your story from 30,000 feet, people could say, oh, openness, connection, information, changed her life. It's so fascinating that you, with that experience, are coming out into the world that we have now, and your perspective on it is not.
It's both. I think it's
100%
both.
positive,
I think
right.
I mean, I gave a commencement speech at Northeastern a couple months ago, and I was trying to think about what do I actually have to say that's useful to these kids. Their lives are probably very different from mine, and I don't know as though anything that I have to say is going to be on a graduation. I can tell them my sad life, but that's graduation. That's not what they want to hear about. And in the end, I talked about my own graduation. My graduation, I had one, and then I posted some pictures of me and my family on Facebook, like everybody. And if you looked at those pictures, you would have thought I was just like any other kid with parents graduating and everyone's happy. But those pictures were a lie, and I posted them because they were a lie. The truth of it was my parents had not come to my graduation because my dad was angry with me because I told him if he called my professors to repentance during the ceremony that I would be angry. He said, well, then I'm not coming, and then he didn't. And then I was graduating from a Mormon university, but I was very anxious because I wasn't sure I believed in Mormonism anymore. There were just many things going on that picture didn't capture. And I actually put it online because it didn't capture that life. And in a lot of ways, I wanted to identify more with that photo. I was building this kind of online life that I identified with more in some ways than my actual life. And I think that can be a deeply alienating experience in a way for people to have this online avatar that we've curated to this insane degree that it actually doesn't represent us and we're hiding ourselves. I think there's a lot of things to think about with the internet, as well as the tremendous power that it has to connect people and show people worlds they haven't considered, and all of that is completely true and completely right. But I think the data that we have would suggest there is a dark side to it, and especially I think for younger people who've grown up with it.
Do you think you see that more clearly by virtue of the life that you led as a young person? I think of you as having these you had these incredible powers of sort of normalization, and yet this incredible power of being able to really see things as they were when you needed to. Do you think you see this world differently than somebody who was raised on a phone or raised on the internet might?
I think I was amazed. I definitely got addicted to Facebook when I was in college, for sure. It was a real problem for me. And considering that I had had almost no technology till I went to college, I think it's kind of remarkable how quickly that took hold.
How would you describe that addiction? What was that?
I think it's the same way any addiction, it's like blacking out. It's 6 o'clock and you have dinner and then you log onto Facebook and then it's 9:30. And you think, what happened?
I just think that's incredible for somebody who's dodging steel in a scrapyard. I mean, literally had to save your own life multiple times. The fact that you got sucked into it is
definitely.
amazing.
I mean, I definitely, and I did regularly. I don't have a Facebook account anymore because I can't handle it. I have the level of addiction management to just like any alcoholic not drink. Like that's the addiction.
Don't go in the bar.
That's the stage at which I can manage my addiction. I can't manage it at the stage where I spend 10 minutes on Facebook. I have never in my life spent 10 minutes on Facebook.
That's so interesting.
I don't know if anybody else has, but I don't. So I find I actually can't fight that, and I don't know anybody who does, actually.
David, how would you say your feelings on these subjects have evolved, right? I mean, because you were there in the beginning when it was just college web pages, you know?
Right, that's fair enough. That's called being old.
Well,
So it's like,
everybody does it.
So I like never had a Facebook account, just partly generational. And my team is here, but I actually have a Facebook account so that when somebody says, did you see this on Facebook, I can go on Facebook and see it. But I've never posted anything on any social media. So, but so here's what's sort of interesting. I think, and I didn't think we would get here, but I think Tara's story is an important reminder that for someone with no experience, with no exposure to the internet, I think it can be overwhelming, addictive. You sort of got to say, oh my God, here's this whole world, and I dive into it. And I was the last thing I want to do is disagree with Tara Westover. You got to be kidding me. But I just
You're
think,
allowed.
I just think that the benefits of the internet are so huge. And I'm an old-fashioned guy. I think parental responsibility, older brother, older sister responsibility, that's where we should rest the responsibility for this. And there'll always be examples of parents who fall down on the job. There'll always be examples of kids who can sneak around their parents and won't take their parents' guidance. But I just believe, for my lawyerly view, and I'm a trained lawyer, I'm a recovering lawyer. I've written a lot of legislation. I can't in my own mind figure out how I'd put pen to paper and write legislation that solves this problem. The dividing line is just too murky.
Right.
So that's my problem. So
Can you
not
imagine,
a commercial for Comcast, but let me just say.
Can you imagine within a company being able to write the rules that make it work?
I think internal company regulation is something that's worth talking about. And Tara talks about a conversation. I think that's a conversation that's worth having. And I think there are conversations happening within these companies and with these companies. And I think that's totally appropriate. So I said, not a commercial for Comcast, but just to prove that there's a conversation going on within our company on this, and how do we empower parents to be able to work with their kids, teach their kids, train their kids. Comcast's high-speed data service, we are the largest ISP in the country. We bundle with our high-speed data service Wi-Fi, which, by the way, almost nobody ever plugs something into the wall anymore. It's all over Wi-Fi. We have a product called xFi that gives the parents the ability on their smartphone to control usage of the internet within their own home. You can do it by device, you can do it for the whole home. So we have a commercial, which you've seen, where the mother turns off the internet in the home for dinner because she didn't want her kids, right, we're gonna talk at the dinner table. We're not gonna be buried in our devices. So the ability to govern the use of the internet in the home, and there are thousands, tens of thousands of parents who are saying, not gonna have the internet during dinner, turning the internet off at 9:30, and are you gonna do your homework? Because you can do it person by person in the house, then I'll turn the internet back on. So we're creating tools that are helping the parents to be able to govern their kids' use of the internet and encourage them to work with their kids to be able to see that they're using the internet in an appropriate way, to get the advantages of it and not to be incapacitated by the addictive and destructive elements of it. And Tara, you haven't even raised, Tara, the thing I'm more scared about are, and this is not talking about tech companies, but the child predators on the internet and the dangerous things that are going on in the internet. So again, for our company, we've actually created partnerships with 20 attorneys general around the country on internet safety for seniors, for kids, for parents, to be able to learn how to protect themselves from internet scams, predators on the internet, a lot of dangerous things that are happening on the internet. So without legislation, without regulation, I think there are a whole bundle of things that can be done to at least reduce the risks that Tara's identified, but keep open the fantastic benefits that can result from having widespread adoption of the internet.
Right.
But the personal responsibility question, just to respond really quickly, I think is an interesting one. I read in a book recently that in some ways thinking of responsibility as a 100% model might be the wrong way to think about it, in the sense that we have good streets and good traffic laws, and we try to design streets so that people will be able to see clearly, but then you also have to have personal responsibility. So it's like a 200% model, like everybody takes responsibility, and that's how we try to avoid catastrophe. And so I think mechanisms like that are incredibly important. But I do think legislatively, it's not like I would say, well, what we need to do is have the government come in and really specify how everything can be used and how everything can be done. But I do think giving people ownership over their own information in an information age is kind of a basic, and I think it would have a huge effect.
I already agreed with you.
Yeah, so, and then the other thing I wonder about is, I do wonder if we've fallen down a bit with some of the big social media companies on antitrust, because I feel like the internet does tend towards monopolies on these social media platforms, and it makes it so another service that comes along and provides the same thing but without the exploitative. Maybe you pay for Facebook. Facebook makes about $10 a month per person through their advertising. I would much rather just give Facebook that money and have them stop manipulating me. That'd be my preference. If there was an alternate to Facebook that I could just give them the money that they get from advertising to me, I would so happily do that. And but the thing is, it's very hard for another one to compete, and as soon as they do, because they're such a monster, they just buy them. And I think that we have had effective antitrust legislation in this country that has been protective of consumers. And I think it's part of that 200% responsibility rule where, yes, there's personal responsibility, but we also have traffic lights.
Right.
So
Can I throw in one thing?
Putting me in an odd position, because not my role to stick up for the big tech companies. As you know, there are allegedly some ongoing antitrust investigations and work, FTC, Department of Justice, and Congress. We know that there is ongoing antitrust activity in Europe. over the big tech companies. I actually was an antitrust lawyer. I think there's at least a little bit of...
Recovering antitrust lawyer.
I said, well, I was an antitrust lawyer, but I think there is some ambiguity here. You'll have an opportunity to address this later in this discussion with Google, if you want to do that. So I think you're right that we've got a well-developed system of antitrust laws and antitrust regulation in this country and in Europe. That issue is in play and will play itself out. But I think there are at least some arguments on both sides of the question, even though I'm not the one to make the arguments on the other side of the question. So I think we'll know more in a couple of years on that space than we know today.
Yeah, that's great. You guys, let's give these guys a big hand, please. Thank you.
Thanks.
You're such a good sport for letting me come on here.
This is great. Remember not to.
And now, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Ramesh Srinivasan, who's a professor at UCLA, studies technology and society. He's one of my favorite guys on Twitter. Please welcome Ramesh. Here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Appreciate it. Nice to meet you. Yes. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Excellent. All right. Hello, Aspen. I'm straight off a flight from Paris, so I'm a little loopy, but I think I'm going to channel that in a positive direction. I'm so honored to be here. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. And what I want to do today is tease a little bit, tantalize you perhaps, with some stories and examples around this important theme that we're discussing today from my new book, which is coming out in October, called Beyond the Valley. And in the meantime, you can engage with me via Twitter, as you can see here. So, they say sometimes don't judge a book by its cover, but I really like the cover of this book. And literally, the way in which I'm thinking about valley here is both literal and figurative. In general, the book explores how we can arrive at a digital world that balances economic and political democratic interests, and also the interests of the global South, the 99.9% of us who are technology and internet users, with a world of profits and business and so on. And that's the goal of the book. Very modest goal, And in this book, I had an opportunity to speak to a number of really interesting folks: Elizabeth Warren, David Axelrod, Obama's data guy, a number of corporate executives, especially, thank you, Google, you were very open to talking to me, Lawrence Lessig, other scholars that have influenced me. And I start the book by really kind of engaging with a theme that I think is really important. We use metaphors, and we always have, to describe the internet, right? How many of you remember the term information superhighway? And how many of you use that term now to describe your experience of being engaged with the internet? All right, 0. So in reality, the internet is a material set of infrastructures, right? And we primarily access the internet in two manners. First through satellites, but also through specifically the literal fiber optic cables that are underneath the ocean surface. So take a look at this map right here and tell me, or at least tell me telepathically, what you think is going on here. Look at the continents of the global South. Specifically, look at the continent of Africa and look at the continent of South America. Only 2 major fiber optic cables connecting those 2 continents, right? And that has very material impacts on the lives of people in these parts of the world. And specifically, the country of Kenya, which is booming in many ways technologically, is partly benefited to be so in that manner because it has a number of fiber optic landing points. But this is particularly interesting to me because the vast majority of internet users now and into the future are not here in North America. They're not even in China. They're in the continents of the global South. Africa is the continent that's most rapidly growing. It's most rapidly growing in terms of internet usage, right? And it's also the youngest continent in our world. So think about catching a flight, right? It reflects these same relationships of asymmetry. It's very difficult to catch a direct flight from Mombasa or Nairobi to Brazil, right? You have to be routed. So infrastructures like the internet always follow relationships of political and economic power. And this is a premise I start my book with. And then the question is, how do we think beyond that? How do we think about the world, the internet, the digital world that we all aspire toward, that we were all excited about, and many of us remain excited about today? Because what's happened, and this is not like really a new story to any of you, is as the amount of information on the internet exponentialized, we turn to platforms and intermediaries. And it's pretty strange when we're interacting in a peer-to-peer way, right? Like I'm renting my apartment to Karan, for example, from Google. That's not going to really happen. But we do it through Airbnb, right? And so the platforms are taking a cut of these transactions, they're monetizing these transactions, and perhaps most importantly, they're gathering data in relation to these transactions. Don't think of Uber, for example, as a taxi company. It's a technology company that is worth what it's worth because of the data it owns, which allows it to potentially incubate new types of businesses like automated vehicle businesses. So I think that's really important. We are at a moment of astonishing economic inequality. Right? Three people and their families in our country here in the United States have equivalent wealth to about 195 million people. 7 or so people and their families in the world have equivalent wealth to the bottom 50% of the global population, which is a little bit under 4 billion. How did we get there? It's not because of technology. It's not the tech company's fault. But technology written in the image of amplifying inequality is going to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. And I think that's why we're at an incredibly important moment. That's why I wrote this book. I wrote the book for a mainstream audience, not full of academic jargon, as much as possible. And I wrote it for anybody to read because I really think it's time to get all hands on deck. We're at an inflection point. This technology has been wonderful. It's served us well. I don't want to demean anybody involved in spearheading and making great amounts of wealth off of this digital revolution, but it's time to rein things in and balance them as well. And that's really important because the business model of a technology platform, just like any business, is to cut costs and increase revenues, right? So if companies like Uber or Airbnb, and that's Alibaba, but we might as well replace it with Amazon right there. If companies are trying to make work essentially obsolescent through automated systems or gig economy labor, which is not collectively bargained, which is not independent, which is independent contractor-based, without wage floors and benefits and healthcare and all of these issues, if the goal is to cut costs and make as much money as possible and own almost nothing, right? What does Airbnb own, right? As an example. Then you got a cash cow that's beyond imaginable. But macroeconomically, that's a disaster for society, right? Because take, for example, this is some years ago, 2012, when Instagram was sold to Facebook. Great deal by Facebook, great deal for Instagram and its 12 employees. They made $1 billion, right? And of course, their VCs and so on. That was within 3 months, if I recall, of when Kodak, with many, many patents in digital imaging, went bankrupt with about 35,000 employees. So 12 people become millionaires while 35,000 people lose their jobs. Think about the macroeconomic issues involved here. So that is really important to situate given the important research of Raj Shetty, who I know is here and actually presented this morning, right? Where we see the fading American dream. Our generation, or at least our kids' generation, is the first generation in American history to make less inflation adjusted than its parents in the history of our country. You couple that with statistics that show that our mortality rate, our life expectancy in this country is decreasing for the first time ever. We see opportunities to engage with the problem here. But it's also important to understand that the valley here doesn't just mean Silicon Valley, but more generally, or metaphorically, concentrated systems of power, right? The concentration of scarce numbers of voices that drive the digital world moving forward. So it's important to also consider the Chinese example. I got a bunch of off-the-record interviews with Chinese tech execs that are in this book, and it's important to note points like this. Tencent, which makes WeChat, which probably many of you know about, integrated platforms, right? An integrated platform that includes messaging, social media, and also payment gateways. Not necessarily surprising to see Facebook make the major announcement around Libra just a couple days ago, right? In a sense, possibly emulating what Tencent does. But Tencent is worth more than Facebook, at least as of 2018, because of its control of the global gaming market as well. So you have to always situate cultural and economic logics. That's what I try to do in this book as one thinks about technological forms of design and their rollouts. Because, of course, in the Chinese case, and you see this across the world, I did a lot of research in about 30 different nations for this book. You see the Silk Road, the new Silk Road, or the One Belt, One Road, which Xi Jinping announced, in action across the world, right? And in some ways, it really presents a very inspiring model, like the uses of renewable energy, because we know, how much energy, literal grid energy, and climate change contributing is the digital world, right? Like our data served on servers. Bitcoin mining is extremely taxing on the grid, right? So this whole myth that the digital world is immaterial, right? Like when I send an email, oh, that's better than sending a letter. It's not quite true. So that's why we have to think about models like what they're doing in China, not necessarily because we want to emulate that, because it's very much based on an authoritarian capitalist system, which I write about, but it gives us some different models of thinking about expansionism around technology and in whose image. So I'm going to show you this example now. I think many of you heard about this. Do you remember when Microsoft built this AI Twitter chatbot, Tay Tweets? How many of you remember that? All right, a few of you remember. So basically, this was a chat bot, right, that was supposed to go onto Twitter and interact with people. It quickly turned racist, xenophobic, misogynist, started hashtagging MAGA. I'm not expressing political opinions here personally, and said it supported genocide in this tweet right here. Why is that? That's the interesting question. Why are the AI systems we're developing, which is the name of the game, the folks I interviewed at Google call themselves an AI company. Why are these AI systems normalizing biases? Well, it has everything to do with who we are as engineers. When we build technology, we build it based on who we are. I am biased. I'm biased in certain ways simply based on who I am, right? So I build technologies just like I write a story or I write a piece of poetry based on who I am. That's part one. We always produce technologies in our image, and we know implicit bias is real. I had an opportunity to interview Eric Holder, our former Attorney General, about that theme in relation to themes like predictive policing and AI systems that are influencing courtroom sentencing decisions. ProPublica did a great article about this about 1.5 years ago. That's one. Who builds technology? We need to have greater inclusivity, greater diversity, greater global inclusion in the design of systems and technologies. Two is these systems learn from data sets, right? So what data sets we feed the learning systems shouldn't represent the biases of our world. They should represent the world we aspire toward, the world we want to live in. And let's think about that first and foremost, because the human messiness is a much bigger and more interesting and important issue than simply building technology in itself. And third key AI point for me is the embeddedness of AI systems. We don't even know increasingly when we're interacting with an AI system. Take, for example, I get a courtroom sentencing decision in Broward County, Florida. The judge makes a decision how long I should serve jail time. And he or she is influenced by an AI system that makes a prediction around the likelihood that I will commit a future crime. And I don't even know that I'm interacting with an AI system. That's an issue. We need auditing, public auditing that involves stakeholders in our society, especially those who are most vulnerable. We have to build technologies in the image of compassion and collectivity. And I think that's really, really important to me. And I think it's really possible that we can get there. Otherwise, we see issues like this. I'm going to just rapid fire show a few of these that I describe in the book. President Obama's face turning whiter based on a facial beauty technology, an AI technology that's supposed to make one's face a little more beautiful. Remember Hot or Not? Anyone remember that one? Kind of like that, but this was built in St. Petersburg, Russia, and they apologized for it, a company called FaceApp. But they didn't know that this would happen, but of course it's not surprising that this would happen. But this is not just potentially showing racial bias, but it's also showing potentially ageist bias also, which I think is interesting. Or another example with facial recognition technologies misidentifying people, false positives. We see Amazon's recognition system being used by ICE agents right now in East LA. I live in Los Angeles, right? And misidentifying undocumented or folks that they think are undocumented and rounding them up and detaining them. And we've seen that happen a few times. Is that what we want? And when I posted this on Facebook, of course, and on Twitter, and so on, when I was reading the story about this, a bunch of my friends kind of snickered. They're like, well, I'm not too happy with Congress anyway. But what happens when those numbers are disproportionately higher for Latino and black and brown members of Congress, which is exactly what ended up happening? The Congressional Black Caucus had a much higher rate of false positive matching. So these are issues. These are opportunities as well. Or another, and this is a really important one for me, is the word embedding algorithm. Remember, it's not AI technologies are not simply about passing the Turing test, right? And I can talk to you about that if you're curious about that. Something I used to be obsessed with. I'm a former AI developer turned social scientist for these reasons. But we're also building AI systems to automate various forms of work, right? The famous statistic that the economists put out is 47% of jobs are going to be automated in some form. That doesn't mean the death of work. That means new forms of work that are secure and just. That's also possible. But word embedding was an algorithm used to potentially replace human resources labor. So now we're not talking about truck driving or taxi driving or what have you. We're talking about various types of white-collar work. And we found out that this word embedding algorithm, this was published in Science and reported on by multiple news outlets, was systematically choosing men over women with more or less equivalent CVs for science and engineering jobs. Why? Because our society has that bias, right? I was a PhD student at Harvard when Lawrence Summers made those famous comments to that effect as well. Not to single him out, but to point out that those biases are prevalent, right? We can't let those things be normalized in invisible ways and dictate our future, or our future is going to worsen these trajectories instead of us intervening right now. So there's some things we can do about this, right? And a bunch of them were discussed by the previous panelists, and that was great. One that's getting some popularity, we're going to see him on the debate stage in the next night or two. I forgot which night he's on. There's too many people for me to keep count, is Andrew Yang's talking about the universal basic income idea. This is seen as some sort of new, if you will, disruptive idea, but actually dividend programs, and I trace the history of them in the United States and different parts of the world, have existed for a long time, and almost all the data on dividend programs show that when you give people a little bit of resources, especially vulnerable people, as society goes through various transitions, they invest those resources to better their families, better their health, better their education. More or less, the data is showing that. And dividend programs have existed. Cherokee Indians had that. Thomas Paine argued for that. Martin Luther King argued for that in his Poor People's Movement. This is something that has been practiced in Alaska for a couple decades, if I'm not mistaken, with oil revenues, right? This shouldn't be a zero sum here. It shouldn't be UBI or nothing, but it's an opportunity for us to think about these technologically facilitated transitions we're going through as a society. We also can think about worker reskilling. This was a story in the New York Times that looked at what miners who might have their jobs replaced by robots in Sweden could do. And AT&T's been exploring these in other areas with worker reskilling, identifying the jobs of the future and getting us on board with them right now. We can even think about the more, if you will, revolutionary alternative, which actually exists in prevalent ways in our society, giving people a little bit of stake, a little bit of equity in digital platforms. Those are also possibilities. There's a movement afoot that I describe in the book called the Platform Cooperative book. But actually, a lot of cooperatives exist already in America. Ace Hardware is a cooperative. I didn't know that until recently. So what I also did in the book, and I'm going to end just with these thoughts, and I would love to talk to you all more about this, is really explore a whole other worldview, which is we think about technologies produced in Silicon Valley or produced in China scaling out to billions of people, and we often objectify, with good intentions, people as users of those technologies. But are they really so passive? Are they simply using Google technologies? Or are they actively appropriating those technologies or even building their own technologies? So the past few years, I've had the opportunity to spend time in southern Mexico, in Oaxaca and Chiapas, funded by the National Science Foundation. And I've been looking at indigenous peoples who've been building their own cell phone networks. The largest cell phone network in the world is right now built and owned and managed and monetized by a collective of Zapotec, Mixtec, and Mixe communities. And I only give this example to show that this is the type of thing that can and should happen in cases where network provision is exploitative or not really producing what people want. We see examples of this with the Detroit Community Technology Project. We saw examples of this in Red Hook in Brooklyn after Superstorm Sandy. Communities using mesh networks to be resilient after the disaster that hit there. There are networks like this that exist all over the world. This is an example that we, the users, can take power over technologies, both on the platform level as well as the infrastructure level as well. And there's a project that I really want to share with you that's like super, super cool called Iktakop, which means words in the wind. And this is a project that is occurring right now in Chiapas, where I've had spent some time, as I mentioned. And what these guys are doing, sorry, I'll go back, whoops. What these folks are doing, the Iktakop people, yeah, there we go, is they literally translate Iktakop as words in the wind. And they wanted internet access in a small community in Chiapas called Abasolo. But what they decided to do is they said, hey, we can't afford traditional ISP access. We can't even afford satellite, that we split the network connection. So they literally connected to one landline connection 30 miles away and rigged the connection. They put little antennas on mountaintops and relayed the signal and brought it into their community. And they're using that backhaul link to the internet to split out their own intranet, right, a local network, and they're also using it to power a technology that I've seen all over the world that people are innovating with that you may not remember, which is community radio. So what if we think about internet in the image of community radio? That's a whole other worldview, right? And we see those types of things happening, because the main point I want to make is we see initiatives happening all over the world. I give tons of stories of this in my book, where people are innovating from the ground up. And part of what we might want to do is challenge the terms we take for granted: innovation, disruption, so on. They're great terms. Tech companies in Silicon Valley, where I'm from, were super innovative. They were super disruptive. But can't innovation also mean doing more with less? Being resourceful? Working with constraints? Let me end and give you a couple examples of this. There's Nas right there, by the way. And this is a collective, like a colectivo they call in Latin America, or a matatu in Kenya. And what they've actually installed are solar-powered Wi-Fi routers on these moving minivans. And instead of the Wi-Fi router just having everybody be in their own bubble, they're actually using this connectivity to share a lot of information, to connect with one another, to support local businesses, and so on. But perhaps more dramatically is what we call the jua kali. The jua kali is in Swahili. We can translate that to hot sun. This is something you see all over the world. People literally with a table, a soldering gun, taking things that are designed to die. I mean, right? Think about Apple's model of planned obsolescence, or perhaps even Monsanto's models of seed obsolescence, if you will. And they're literally extending life through repair and recycle. What about repair and recycle and renewal as new sort of visions that we can think about in relation to innovation moving into the future? Literally taking things that are designed to die and maintaining their life. Because when you see this in action, it just blows your mind, right? And these are folks called AB3D, Africa Born 3D, that I tell some stories about in the book. And what they're doing is they've literally built 3D printers using almost completely recycled and dumpstered parts. And they're finding that those 3D printers have not only created a sustainable business, but they actually are more affordable and more resilient because they're designed for the local environment by local entrepreneurs. They tell me, hey, we're Jua Kali, we're hot sun people, we now just have a roof. And this is what they built. So my main point here in writing a book called Beyond the Valley is to just inspire us to think in open ways about the internet. The internet has been amazing, it continues to be amazing, exposes us to so much. But let's think about what kind of internet we want and make sure we restore balance. And so in that sense, that's the goal of Beyond the Valley. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, we've heard a lot of fascinating ideas and proposals about the internet and where it's going and technology's impact on our lives. So I've been asked to give you 10 minutes about Facebook. And That's partly because a Facebook executive was originally going to be on the stage and is not. My name's David Kirkpatrick. I'm a tech journalist. I wrote a book called The Facebook Effect, and I've been really following Facebook quite closely ever since September of 2016 when I met Mark Zuckerberg, when Facebook had 9 million users. As you may know, today it has 2.5 billion users, so a lot has changed. And so I was asked to talk about what people in this group might not know about Facebook, and particularly 3 things that you might not have thought about. So I've got a few introductory comments, and then I'll get to those 3 things. And there's so much to say about Facebook. It's kind of crazy. But, you know, in the description for this panel, one of the questions was, who's winning the battle for the soul of the internet? I don't think too many of us have a lot of doubt about that. The winners of everything in the internet thus far have been a small number of global companies, Facebook being one of them, another one about to be represented on this stage. There is this vast power disparity that has emerged in the world where a very small number of companies have global power and influence of a style and scope that we've never really seen before, and that in many ways dwarfs the influence of countries. And yet we have no regulatory or oversight framework for that, which is seriously problematic. But the scale of impact that Facebook in particular has had demands some kind of containment or oversight. And I think probably most people in this room, and pretty much everyone who pays attention to the news in the United States and most developed countries at this point, is starting to say something different has to be done about these companies. The problem is, as has been hinted up on the stage, we don't really know exactly what to do. I just want to quickly overview some of the problems. The attention economy on which the targeted ad-based model of these companies depends has a lot of very perverse and societally damaging incentives. And it particularly rewards conversation and information that tends people towards fear and anger, because that's what gets your attention. And attention and time spent online is what these companies typically have sought to achieve from us. Electoral interference, we know a lot about. If Donald Trump had not won in large part, or in part, because of Russian fake news and ads on Facebook, this conversation would have a very different tenor right now. That has changed the nature of the dialogue. Addiction and distraction, we've heard about that. These are big, big issues. I'm just glancing over a number of things. But systems of these type, Facebook, Google, Amazon, they have not had the governance to deal with the threats they encountered. And in many cases, I think particularly in the case of Facebook, the companies literally do not know what to do about the problems, although they are incrementally making some moves, which I'll mention. But what are some of the consequences of these challenges? Well, for one, the rise of authoritarian leaders around the world cannot be entirely separated from the existence of these platforms, which enable information manipulation at a scale we've never seen. It has played a big role in the election of people like Orban, Duterte, Bolsonaro, etc. They are all masters of deceptive and dishonest social content, especially on Facebook. But these platforms are in many ways facilitating social division in general, among other things they do. For example, in the realm of misinformation, the anti-vaccination movement, which has been supercharged by dialogue on these services, partly because it generates fear and anger, is now considered one of the top global health threats by the World Health Organization. So that's something very new. And one of the things that I fault Facebook on in particular, just to mention before I get to the 3 things you should know, is that they expanded globally and put a priority on growth above all things, especially into geographies and languages where they had no expertise, no employees who spoke the language, and essentially there was no governance literally in those places, which is a large percentage of the planet. So what are some 3 things that I would like you to think about? 1, Facebook is the most profitable company of its size that has ever existed from the standpoint of profits per dollar of revenue. Its margins were as much as 43%. That's after tax in the not distant past. Now they're spending a little bit more on remediation. Margins have gone down slightly, but it's a phenomenally profitable business. And this is one reason why, and by the way, it is many quarters it has been roughly twice as profitable as Google on a net margin basis. But this is why many people like me become so appalled that it did not spend what it would have taken to have built a better governed, more civil, and safer communication system. Because it did not spend on these kind of foreseeing these harms, remediating these harms, until very, very recently when it has effectively been forced to do so. But you may wonder, why has Facebook been so inept and slow to respond to these myriad social problems that its systems have contributed to? Why have they not seemed to have heard the voices of so many people, like many in this room who applauded before, that we have about them and these companies in general? Why does Facebook seem not to get that? Inside Facebook, the leaders and many employees feel deeply misunderstood. They believe that the benefits the company brings to society are far greater than the harms, and that the harms are real, but we are being deeply unfair in focusing on the negatives. It's so bad that you could really say that, like Donald Trump, they often see negative commentary about themselves as fake news. I think this is shifting, but this has been a big part of why they've been so slow to take the social objections that people have had to their behavior seriously. They've really successfully blocked a lot of it out. And I think the sheer scale of wealth that they've accumulated, Mark Zuckerberg being the most affluent young person in the history of humanity, does distort the thinking process. How much is his psychiatrist's question. But if I'm rich enough to be doing this, if I'm this rich doing this, I must be doing something right. That mindset is not absent from the equation. But it's interesting, too, for me as sort of a professional observer of Facebook, to note that in the last couple of years, Facebook has had almost literally no public defenders, even as they have not been able to understand why we don't see how good they are. But now, to seemingly contradict myself and to try to be a little bit fair for a minute, maybe a little counterintuitive, for all of its sins, this is the third point, I didn't enumerate them enough. The third point, Facebook still plays a highly constructive role in the world. And it actually plays an especially constructive role in the world with regard to some of the things Ramesh was talking about outside of our context, most of us being from the United States and developed countries. So in a way, its employees are not wrong to think that we outside critics are ignoring the positive side of the story. The benefits in developing countries of these platforms are astonishing and gigantic. I mean, in many places in the world, Facebook almost literally is the internet. It's brought rich communications to many parts of the world for the first time. It's a huge locus of entrepreneurship and an engine of growth. There's tons of companies being started on Facebook. So we can legitimately worry that the problems about what we've had with fake news and addiction could, and probably already are, emerging quite dramatically in those parts of the world. But there are genuine benefits, and there's plenty of benefits in the United States too, which I don't have time to discuss. But I do want to emphasize how problematic it is, in my mind, that the dishonest and corrupt leaders of the world are the ones who are, in many cases, most expertly manipulating the systems of Facebook for their own advantage. And a classic example is Myanmar, which we heard a lot about, the Rohingya genocide being facilitated on Facebook. But here's an amazing thing. Facebook did throw the head of the Myanmar junta off Facebook, but only after a UN report specifically said that Facebook was contributing to genocide by not having done so. That's how much pressure they require. So they're not evil people. There is a PR blitz underway, as we will probably experience tomorrow. And they are making a lot of changes. They're hiring these moderators. They think AI is going to help. They have 30,000 people reading content in many languages. Will it be enough? Probably not. I think we need a new global approach. We've heard a number of sort of suggestions of things that we need to do. We need a much more holistic dialogue about what a healthy internet would look like. Unfortunately, because they're global systems, it needs to be a global dialogue. That's hard to imagine. My own opinion seems kind of idealistic, is that we need some sort of Paris Accords or Geneva Convention around the internet, and it needs to include not just governments, but business and civil society. It's an unprecedented new challenge. How to regulate, how to oversee this astonishingly productive but seriously problematic new part of our society. So with that, I will allow this smorgasbord of great ideas to continue.
All right. Am I connected? Oh, I am connected, my God. So I'd like to congratulate you on being here. Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Turns out that's what it takes.
Save the best for last.
Yeah,
huh?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So Karan Bhatia, you may know, is global head of policy, is
Yep.
that right? Head of global
Yep.
policy. And so one thing, just to sort of get people oriented to how you see the world a little bit, what's it like to go from GE, which operates in a pretty, well-established space? We know somewhat the rules of manufacturing, the rules of international trade. These are things that people have hashed out over the years. What's it like to go from there to this new industry where there's all kinds of new stuff coming up that nobody has ever done before?
So in some senses, Jake, it's different, and I'll come to that. But in some senses, it's actually not that dissimilar, right? I mean, in both GE and with Google, you're operating with very global paradigms, right? Mm-hmm. So whether it's transportation markets, infrastructure markets, or in the case of Google, obviously, information, there is an inherent global scale to both of these businesses. So I think there's some commonality there. Some of the biggest challenges that I think people face in all of these markets are how do you think about size and scale of these businesses and what the right relationship is, government and individual. There are issues of safety, of security, so some of the same policy issues do cut throughout. Right. Obviously some of the bigger differences are, GE is a 130-year-old company. It's operating in very mature markets. And it's a company that frankly has had 100+ years of working with governments.
Yeah, right.
I think Google is a 20-year-old company. It's a company that, really has been into the spotlight and scrutiny for really the last 10 years as it's grown globally and as the impact of the internet has become more and more pervasive on people's lives. Right. So in a certain sense, I sort of analogize to where Google is today to where, electricity was in a certain sense, maybe in like the 1910s or the 20s. It's at the outset. And, there's been a lot of discussion about regulation. Unquestionably, this is a sector that's going to see more government interaction, more government intervention, much as there was around some of the foundational technologies that existed, 100 years ago, whether it's transportation or electricity. Or
For me, I think when I think about the distinction between those two companies, one, I think, if you asked me to write it down, I feel like I could do a pretty good job of explaining what GE does and how they do it, right? And I think one of the difficulties that Google has as a entity is explaining itself to those of us who use it every day. I feel like there's this feeling that we interact with it, we understand its value in our lives to some extent, we don't really know how it works. And I think that's even more so true for other companies,
Yes, and I think it's on us to help explain sort of how does search work, for instance. But I'll say the other thing is it's an incredibly dynamic sector. been here all of 9 months at this point in time, but even within this period, just watching, how much change there is happening in the sector where companies that you didn't think were, competing with each other now are or are going to be. New products are coming online. New innovations are coming online. Things are being, brought online, taken offline. So the amount and the pace of the change, the technological change, the commercial change, and the intersection of that with sort of the public policy set of issues is really remarkable. And I think I agree with you in that sense substantially.
Yeah. So, Tara did I think an excellent job of sort of, breaking down this notion that there is this, that there can, she, I think really stands in for so many people in talking about the need to control our data. I think about, on Monday, Senators Mark Warner and Josh Hawley introduced this new dashboard act that will supposedly force companies with more than 100 million users to reveal the value of the data they're collecting on those users. Can we do that? Governor Newsom in California wants to create a digital dividend where you do in fact pay people for their data.
Yeah.
Now that you've been there 9 months, and you've seen the scheme, can we do that?
So, we can do a lot of things, obviously. I think the question that society is going to need to wrestle with, the U.S. is going to want to wrestle with, is, at the end of the day, I think underlying a lot of these sets of concerns is questions about sort of equity and fairness, a sense that large companies are being benefited by accessing data that in some ways derives up from the users. Now, let me start by pointing out that in Google's case, most of our revenues, almost all of our revenues derive from ads.
Right.
And almost all of the our targeting of ads is based on the query you type in. It's not based on some subsidiary sets of information that we have on you and whatnot.
Right.
So put that in sort of, our business model would be, we would continue to operate much as we do right now, regardless. But I think.
So even, just so I understand, so even if let's say regulators forced you as a company with over 100 million users to reveal the value of each person's data, it wouldn't change the business that much because of the singular focus of this advertising-driven business.
Right now, when you type in, when we are placing ads for digital cameras, most of where we know how to target it to is because people are typing in digital cameras.
Right.
The question about the data, what we do with the data really gets, we use the incremental data that we gather fundamentally mostly to improve the quality of the products that we're producing. So Google Maps, for instance, captures a lot of data, and we use it to try and make a better map product for those of you who, hopefully are finding your way around your home, your cities, and traveling and whatnot with maps. So you can absolutely take steps to limit or place a price on or do whatever you want with respect to companies' abilities to capture data. There will be an incremental cost to that. It will mean that there will be less product improvement that may happen. There may be less that's put into R&D. That may be a trade-off that society ultimately wants to make. That's for society to decide. But my point to you is twofold. One, don't assume that there's no cost to it. Every legislative step is going to have a counter-reaction. The other question fundamentally is, if the issue really is about what the equitable division is, maybe we should be thinking about issues like, taxes. Maybe we should be thinking about some of the issues that Ramesh was alluding to before, which are sort of different ways of trying to address that fundamental question.
This question of sort of, weighing, the benefit to society versus the cost to society. I'm reminded there's this thing called the hand rule. Where Justice Learned Hand had this whole thing about, is it better to do without the thing, or should the company have to pay for the thing? Who bears the cost? Which for me, has been such an interesting way of looking at this stuff. I think about China, and so China has turned this corner where they have basically taken all the brakes off when it comes to surveillance, right? It's a totally, everyone down to the tiny, whether you talk in the quiet car is being registered now, passed up through ostensibly commercial enterprises into a government structure that surveils everybody. But when I have interviewed people in those institutions and in those places, they have no embarrassment about it. They say it's working great, and it's really, fabulous. The trade-off is great because there's control is sort of the fundamental takeaway. And yet here in the United States, I also see, I was just on the phone with a senator the other day who was saying that we have to compete with China in something like AI.
Yeah.
Right? And pour data into AI in order to make it work.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering for you, with your experience around the world and seeing as you have over these 9 months how Google operates, can we create successful, as you say, dynamic companies and still respect what is this sort of emerging American tradition of don't spy on me, and compete with a country like China, which is making technological leaps and bounds because they have no such qualms? How do you look at that?
So I think my immediate answer to your question is yes,
Yeah.
and I think we can, and I don't see technological excellence and innovation as being incompatible with privacy, and I think we at Google feel pretty passionately about that.
It's tough
But-
because, I'll just say, the original technical concept at Google was more data with a dumb algorithm beats less data with a smart algorithm.
So let me couple of clarifying points, and I'll come back.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
the first is just for general screen or scene setting. Google actually does very, very little in China itself. So I know there's been a variety of discussions out there as to whether how we're active in the market and whatnot. We were in the market with a search engine product from 2006 to 2010. We've exited the market. We're not in that market right now. We do a limited amount of business selling ads. They're relatively quite small. So we're not, we are hardly a company to be talking to about doing a lot of business in the China market.
Sure.
Point one. I get your point is a different one. Two things I would say. The first is if you talk to our engineers and data scientists, one of the things I've picked up in my limited times is they will tell you it's not just massive amounts of data, it's sort of the quality of data and the level of excellence that goes along with it. In a certain sense, you have to think about it as the overall sort of ecosystem and how competitive are we in the United States altogether versus China. So yes, 1.3 billion people, structures and strictures that you're talking about that tend to aggregate is one component to that, but so too is a very different regulatory climate, a very different climate in terms of attracting international talent than we have. So I guess what I would say is you can't pick out one single strand, you have to balance the two against each other.
Yeah.
Having said all of that, let me lead, back to your original point, today 9 out of the top 20 technology companies in the world are Chinese.
Right.
The other 11 are American. It is fair to say that the future nature of competition, particularly in third country markets, some of the markets that Ramesh's terrific presentation alluded to, is going to be one where there are two different visions of the internet. There's going to be one where you're going to be accessing, the kinds of products that Google and others represent, or you're going to be accessing, Chinese technology.
And do you think, is the moral arc of history long and it bends toward justice, or do we not know which way it bends and we're figuring that out?
I don't, honestly, I don't know. I think many of us grew up in an era where the moral arc seemed clearly to be bending towards globalization.
Right.
My story, my father immigrated to the United States from India. Over the period of time that he was here, we saw the village that he came from be electrified. And its biggest addition was when computers started showing up and mobile phones started showing up and people started to be connected, and kids who theretofore had never sort of been able to dream of being connected into the global economy now are, and small businesses are. And that's just such an incredible transformational change that we hate to give up the idea of that vision sort of not being the future, right? That we look at a much more balkanized global economy. But the reality is, the last, not just 3 or 4 years, but honestly, 10 or 15 years, post WTO accession for China has probably been largely a period of disaggregation and a weakening of global institutions. And that is concerning.
Yeah, that's right. Thinking about balkanization, I think about balkanization of sort of the regulatory structures that we're seeing, or the regulatory sort of philosophies that we're seeing emerge, right? There's the US, which half the time seems based on elected officials who don't even know how Facebook works, right? And so it's not an encouraging time. There's Europe, where they are doing a slow, steady, but pretty, you know, what's the right word for it? You know, they're in there.
Yeah.
You know, they're really
Yeah.
trying to regulate it. And then there's China, where the whole worldview is sort of opposite of ours in a lot of ways when it comes to this stuff. Do you see a strand of regulatory philosophy that you think Google can live with, that Google is going to try to pursue in this country?
Well, look, I mean, we're a big company. We've got to be global. We have to be global. And so we are going to inevitably have to figure our way through whatever the different regulatory regimes throw at us, with the exception, as I pointed out, you know, we're barely in China. But we face different sets of requirements in different countries around the world, and we're a law-abiding company, and we try to live with them. I think what I would, couple of, again, answers. One is, look, I'm not going to be apologetic about what I see as being the advantage of the U.S. model. I think there's a reason why the United States is the country that has produced, you know, this incredible, you know, host of innovations, and not just in the internet space, in so many others.
Right.
So I think that regulatory philosophy in general is right. Do I believe that there is space and indeed the need for more regulation of the internet in the United States? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we've called for greater, you know, universal legislation or
Why is
comprehensive
that?
legislation around privacy.
Why have you called for it? Why do you call for
Around
it?
privacy?
Yeah, well, around all
I
this.
mean, for many reasons. I mean, one is if you actually look at what is happening potentially with state-by-state legislation, you could in fact see the United States break down into something that looks like Europe pre-GDPR, where you would have sort of a series of different regimes which would make it extremely cumbersome for anybody but the most large, most, you know, well-resourced companies to comply.
Do you think that can it be such that one country enacts a set of regulations in the same way that, let's say, California enacted emissions regulations, right? And then it drives the whole industry. You know, France, right, is now considering legislation that would require a company to turn over 4% of its global revenue as as a fine for violating privacy. And you know, and Facebook just today has announced that they are going to, not announced, but it was revealed by Reuters that they are going to turn over identifying information on hate speech users in part, and I don't know if it's because of that, but it feels to me like, oh, there's some real regulatory teeth all of a sudden. Can one country's regulations set the tone for everybody, or do we have to have a multinational structure?
Well, first of all, I certainly see that, you know, the risk of that regulatory fragmentation happening. I think it is happening, and you know, I would hope, as someone who believes in globalization, that we would have. I recognize it's not an era that sort of gives rise naturally to that, but I think at least a convergence around global norms in some of these spaces would be helpful. But in terms of a country setting a set of rules and they becoming sort of the global standard, I think it somewhat depends upon who the country is, right? A country of sufficient size and scale and effect globally. I mean, we've seen that. And you know, a great example of where we've seen that is, in fact, the United States, where, you know, in other sectors, take it as aviation as an example, you've seen the U.S. be willing to push out global norms that have, in fact, made the United States' aviation industry the you know, envy of the world. So I think there is the opportunity for the U.S. to play a leadership role here.
Do you think that the U.S. is the only country of adequate scale to force the world's hand?
No, I think Europe, certainly you see actively doing this in multiple sectors, and I think China is as well.
Is as well. Let's take a few questions from the audience, because I bet there's a couple. I'm just going to say here. We have a mic. Throw up a hand if you've got it. I know some of you have hands. No? Really? Well,
There he
is. There he is. They're tired. It's tough.
It's the altitude.
It's the altitude. That's right. That's what's messing with me. Here we go.
So you saw the whole session. You were here from the beginning. What did you think about Tara's idea of people owning their own data? And really take it to the extreme level. Could Google still exist if people owned their own data and whatever that meant. Talk that through a little bit.
So I think it was, first of all, I really enjoyed the panel. I thought it was great. To some extent, it sort of ties back in with the discussion I think we were having before about could Google continue to exist? Well, first of all, let me say, we have gone to great lengths to permit people to take data out of the system, which if you are familiar with us, you'll know. But beyond that, look, the bulk of our revenues derive from, as I was driving, sort of search ads that don't require us to do that. So I think it's not a question of viability. I think we could continue to be perfectly commercially viable. I think the question is, what is the set of trade-offs that you get from that, right? And that's
Would it
the
damage the
discussion.
company's
And
value to
that's-
customers?
Well, I just think, there is data that is utilized in improving products day to day.
Right.
And that's sort of the question that, does society want to make that trade-off?
It is interesting that we've gotten to this place where you just assume that it will tell you where to go exactly,
And that it will keep improving itself.
right. That's right. Who else? Great question, by the way. Thank you for that one. No?
I think we had one over there.
It's a long march for the mic, but here it is. There we go, great.
We're just curious if you're seeing anything generationally between, most of the people in this room versus teenagers and their view of privacy,
Yeah.
and how that seems to be pretty, a dynamic that's changing all the time, because it seems like the younger generation has a much less expectation of any sort of privacy.
Have you found
I
that
don't.
true?
I haven't dived into that honestly. I mean, I think we clearly sort of see privacy as being something that is an important value to a lot of people. We see it rising in concern in different age groups. I think we see it rising in concern in different regions around the world. We see it, which is one of the reasons why I think we've continued to make it a big focus and look to innovate products around that, and and address what we see as being a clear consumer demand in that regard.
And let me go back to a question before we do our final question, but you had mentioned that you've gone to great lengths to keep people from taking data out of the system, did I hear
No.
you correctly?
I'm saying we're going to great lengths to enable them to take data.
to enable them to take it out.
So if you want to export your data, you are able to do so.
I see. Because I would think that there would be, in that board meeting, there would be somebody at the table being like, oh, let's not make that happen.
No, we've been actually quite supportive of that.
Supportive of that idea. That's interesting. Okay, great. Last question, anybody? Yes, sir. I'll take you as well. Don't worry, we got time. Thank you.
I guess I pick up on Tara's point that she made at the beginning of regulations in this industry, and I guess I liken it much to the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
That I think you mentioned at the beginning with electricity and
Right.
so forth, and that eventually the federal government did step in and say, we need to regulate these things. And I think the federal government in the United States is there, but as I watch the deliberations on Congress, it seems like a whole bunch of people who have no idea what they're talking about. Right? So how do they legislate something they really don't understand?
Yeah.
And I just got on my Apple Watch, that although the federal government is saying we shouldn't be selling parts to Huawei, we're selling parts to Huawei and the federal government doesn't know how to respond.
Yeah.
So where do we go with legislation for people who really don't understand how to do this, knowing that we've got to do something?
So, I mean, from my vantage point, I will say I think the interactions that you have I have had in my, again, limited time, different kinds of interactions with different kinds of policymakers around the Hill. There are some where it is true. Their level of understanding and familiarity with tech is relatively minimal. There are others who are quite deep into it and do have a much deeper understanding, and I think that's improving. So I'm more optimistic, I think, about the ability of legislators ultimately to get their head around at least the technicalia of it. What I think is the greater challenge is that when people talk about regulating tech, everybody means, or there are many different sort of aspects to that, right? I mean, are we talking about regulating content? Are we talking about regulating commercial interactions in some sense? Are we talking about regulating privacy? Are we talking about regulating security? So there, I mean, you can, all may be legitimate subjects for discussion, but there is no single sort of body of, okay, regulate means in this box. So I think one of the initial conversations that really needs to happen is exactly what is the set of issues that we're looking to try and address.
Josh Hawley's other piece of legislation would give you immunity if you allow every 2 years an audit to make sure that you're politically neutral, which is one of those things where you just sort of go, what? What are we talking about here? You know, that's very interesting. You will be our last question.
Okay. So I'm interested in your role. What motivates you, and what are you most hoping to achieve at Google?
So I mentioned before that my background was my father emigrated to the States. My grandparents lived in a village in India that had no electricity, barely any running water, and certainly no access to information. And I spent 10 years at GE because what I really wanted to do was help bring fundamentally infrastructure to a lot of the parts of the world that didn't have it. I moved to Google because I feel like the next great opportunity, what is going to empower and generate growth, not just, by the way, in emerging markets around the world, but actually here in the United States, is the internet. I see it, I mean, we see it every day, small and medium-sized businesses that are creating growth whose existence is enabled by the internet. So there are tons of issues out there. I'll be the first one to recognize, I think Tara did a nice job laying some of them out. There are ethical issues that we have to wrestle with. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the power of this phenomenon to make lives better is something that gets me up every day and is the reason why I'm doing this job.
You guys, please thank Karan and all of our speakers tonight. Thank you so much.